My name is Grace. I'm 34 years old. And 3 months ago, standing in the rain beside my father's grave, my sister Victoria looked me dead in the eyes and called me a burden. She said it loud enough for the entire funeral gathering to hear, loud enough for our relatives to shift uncomfortably, loud enough for my mother to pretend she hadn't heard anything at all. But what Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a stranger standing at the edge of the cemetery was about to hand me a sealed envelope that would unravel 20 years of lies. I need to go back to explain how we got here. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant understanding one fundamental truth. Victoria was the sun, and the rest of us were simply orbiting planets. She was 3 years older than me, conventionally beautiful, academically gifted, and possessed this magnetic quality that made people want to please her. I was the quiet one. The one who helped Dad in his woodworking shop on weekends. The one who made average grades and had a small circle of friends and never quite fit the mold my mother had envisioned. My father, Richard Mitchell, owned a modest but successful furniture restoration business. He'd started it with $700 and a borrowed pickup truck in 1985. By the time I was born, Mitchell Restorations was known throughout the region for quality craftsmanship. Dad taught me everything: how to identify wood grain, how to strip varnish without damaging the original finish, how to see the potential in broken things. "Gracie," he'd say, running his weathered hands over a damaged dresser, "everything worth saving takes patience. Remember that." Victoria never set foot in the shop. She found it beneath her. My mother, Patricia, agreed. "Victoria has better things to do with her time," she'd say whenever Dad suggested Victoria learn the business. "She's going to be a lawyer or a doctor." Something important. Something important. As if creating beauty from destruction wasn't important at all. When I was 18, Dad sat me down in his office. The walls were covered with photographs of restored pieces, before and after shots that documented decades of transformation. He pulled out a folder. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. "You're the only one who understands this work. When I retire, I want you to take over. I've already talked to Harold." Harold Brennan was Dad's attorney, had been for 30 years. "But what about Victoria and Mom?" Dad's expression shifted into something complicated. Sad, maybe, resigned. "Your mother and I have an arrangement. She has her inheritance from her parents. Victoria will be taken care of. But this business, Gracie, this is yours. It was always supposed to be yours." I didn't fully understand then. I was 18 and flattered and in love with the idea of preserving my father's legacy. I signed the papers Harold put in front of me. I didn't ask questions. I trusted my father completely. That was my first mistake. 3 years into community college, I got the call that changed everything. Dad had suffered a massive stroke. He survived, but the damage was extensive. He couldn't speak clearly. He couldn't walk without assistance. He couldn't work. I dropped out immediately. There wasn't even a decision to make. Someone had to run the business. Someone had to take care of him. Victoria was in her final year of law school in Boston. She called once a week, sometimes every 2 weeks. Mom handled the arrangements with barely concealed resentment, as if Dad's illness was a personal inconvenience. For 8 years, I ran Mitchell Restorations. I managed the employees. I handled the clients. I balanced the books. I also changed my father's sheets, administered his medications, drove him to physical therapy 3 times a week, and sat with him on his bad days when he couldn't remember my name. Victoria visited twice a year, Christmas and Dad's birthday. She'd breeze in wearing expensive clothes, kiss his forehead, cry for exactly 15 minutes, then leave for the hotel because the house was too depressing. My mother retreated into her own world. Bridge clubs and garden committees and charitable foundations that allowed her to write checks instead of providing actual care. When I turned 32, something shifted in my father. His eyes became clearer. His speech, while still difficult, improved. During one of our late-night talks, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "The papers," he said, struggling with each word. Harold still valid. What papers, Dad? The business, yours, don't let them take. I didn't understand then. I thought he was confused, mixing up past and present the way stroke patients sometimes do. But Dad knew something I didn't. He knew what was coming. He passed away on March 15th. Peacefully in his sleep with my hand in his. I called my mother first, then Victoria, then the funeral home. Victoria arrived the next day. Within hours, she'd taken over the arrangements. The flowers, the music, the guest list, the catering. She spoke to the funeral director with the same commanding presence she used in courtrooms. Grace can handle the small details, she said, barely glancing at me. I'll manage the important things. The important things, like always. On the morning of the funeral, I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Victoria and my mother were in the kitchen, speaking in low voices that carried further than they realized. The lawyer says the will reading is scheduled for Monday, Victoria said. Everything should transfer smoothly. What about the business? Mom asked. What about it? Dad was incapacitated for 8 years. Any decisions he made before the stroke can be contested. I already have a colleague looking into it. The business should be valued at roughly $800,000, maybe more with the property. And Grace, there was a pause, a long one. Grace can find a job. She's had a free ride long enough, living in that house, pretending to run a business she has no legal claim to. It's time she faced reality. My hands shook so violently I had to set down my coffee cup. I stepped back into the shadows, pressing my palm against my mouth to keep from making a sound. At the cemetery, everything felt surreal. The gray sky, the minister's words that seemed to come from very far away, the faces of relatives I barely recognized. I stood beside the grave, numb, watching my father's casket lower into the earth. That's when Victoria approached me. We need to discuss your living situation, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The house will need to be sold. The house, Dad's house, our parents' house, which will be divided equally between Mom and me as the legitimate heirs. Victoria, I've lived there for 8 years. I took care of him for 8 years. I ran his business. You played at running a business. Her voice rose slightly. You dropped out of college, Gracie. You have no degree, no credentials, no legal standing. You were a caretaker. Paid in room and board. You were a burden Dad was too soft-hearted to send away. The word hit me like a physical blow. Burden. Patricia enabled it, of course, Victoria continued. But now that Dad's gone, we need to be realistic. The business will be sold. The house will be sold. You'll receive a small stipend to help you get on your feet. That's more than fair, considering you contributed nothing of actual value. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The rain had started, soft at first, then harder. Mourners were drifting toward their cars. My mother stood under a black umbrella, watching us, saying nothing. That's when I noticed him, a man in a dark coat, standing near the cemetery gates. He was older, maybe mid-60s, with silver hair and a weathered face. He looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't place him. He walked toward us, slowly, deliberately. Grace Mitchell, Victoria stepped forward. I'm sorry, this is a private family gathering. If you're here about business matters, you can contact my office. I'm not here for you. His voice was quiet but firm. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored. Heavy stock, my father's handwriting on the front, for Grace, to be delivered upon my death. RM, your father gave this to me 3 years ago, the man said. I'm Harold Brennan's partner, Edward Cole. Harold passed last year, but he made me promise to fulfill this obligation personally. Victoria's face went pale. What is that? That's not your concern. Edward looked at me with something like compassion. Your father was a very careful man, Ms. Mitchell. He wanted to make sure you were protected. Everything you need is in this envelope. He pressed it into my hands and walked away before Victoria could say another word. That night, alone in my bedroom in the house I'd lived in for 8 years, I opened the envelope. Inside were documents, dozens of them, and a handwritten letter. My dearest Gracie, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And I suspect your mother and sister are already trying to take what's rightfully yours. I've spent the last years of my life making sure they can't. The documents told the full story. In 2015, my father had transferred full ownership of Mitchell Restorations to me, not partially. Fully, the business, the property, the equipment, the client list, the intellectual property, everything. The transfer had been witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county recorder's office. Victoria had no legal claim, neither did my mother, but there was more. Dad had also created a trust. The house we lived in had been placed in that trust when I was 21, with me as the sole beneficiary. My mother had a right to live there during her lifetime, but she couldn't sell it. Couldn't modify it, couldn't transfer it. The final document was a letter from Dad to Harold, dated just 6 months before his stroke. It detailed conversations he'd overheard between my mother and Victoria. Conversations about convincing him to change his will, about declaring him mentally incompetent, about having me removed from any inheritance because I was simple and couldn't be trusted with money. They've been planning this for years, Harold, my father had written. I know my wife. I know my oldest daughter. They see Grace as an obstacle. But Grace is the only one who ever loved me for who I was, not what I could give her. Protect my daughter. Please. The will reading on Monday was a disaster. For Victoria. I arrived with my own attorney, a woman named Sandra Chen who specialized in estate disputes. When the official will was read, Victoria's smug expression turned to confusion, then fury. My father's personal assets, roughly $200,000, were divided between my mother and sister. But the business and the house were conspicuously absent from the will. Because they were already transferred, Sandra explained calmly, presenting the documentation. Years ago, legally, irrevocably. Victoria stood so quickly her chair fell over. This is fraud. He was incapacitated. He couldn't have made these decisions. These transfers occurred in 2015, Sandra replied. Your father's stroke happened in 2016. A full year after the documents were executed. I have medical records, witness statements, and notarized affidavits confirming his mental competency at the time of signing. My mother stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. You manipulated him. No, my voice was steady, stronger than I expected. I loved him, I took care of him, and he took care of me. The way family is supposed to. Victoria contested the transfer, of course. She filed motions. She hired forensic accountants. She demanded investigations. Each one came back the same way. The documents were legitimate. The transfer was valid. Mitchell Restorations, valued at $923,000 including property, belonged entirely to me. The legal battle lasted 4 months. Cost Victoria roughly $60,000. Cost me nothing, because Sandra worked on contingency, and my father had apparently set aside a legal defense fund specifically for this purpose. In August, Victoria's final motion was denied with prejudice. The judge's ruling was blunt. The documentation is overwhelming. This matter is closed. I haven't spoken to my mother or sister since the will reading. Victoria sends occasional emails, fluctuating between rage and attempts at reconciliation. I delete them unread. My mother sold her share of the inheritance and moved to Florida. She didn't say goodbye. Mitchell Restorations is thriving. I hired 2 new apprentices last month. Young people who remind me of myself at 18, eager to learn, willing to see beauty in broken things. Last week, I restored an antique rocking chair. Oak, probably 1920s, badly damaged by water and neglect. When I finished, I sat in my father's old office, surrounded by his photographs, and I finally let myself cry. Not from grief, from gratitude. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want to share 3 lessons that changed my life. First, document everything. My father knew a battle was coming, and he prepared for it. Keep records. Save communications. Protect yourself legally even when it feels unnecessary. Second, your worth isn't determined by the people who undervalue you. I spent 30 years believing I was somehow less than my sister. I wasn't. I was different. Different isn't less. Third, and most importantly, love is demonstrated through action, not words. Victoria could give speeches about family loyalty. She could cry at funerals and perform grief beautifully. But when it mattered, when my father needed actual care and sacrifice, she was nowhere to be found. Love shows up. Remember that. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Share your own experiences. You're not alone, and your voice matters. Like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. And remember, sometimes the people who call you a burden are simply upset that you've stopped carrying theirs.